Welcome back. So since you saw a snapshot of Contact Monkey during your break, friendly reminder, if you're interested in learning more about the platform, click on the Learn More button just above the chat bar. It should be in your right-hand corner. Our next session is how to motivate leaders to be more effective communicators during change. And as we mentioned, we have two incredible voices in comms, Jenni and Advita Patel.
These two bring such a wealth of experience from building inclusive communication strategies to helping leaders set up during times of transformation.
So get your questions ready for the Q&A, and don't forget you can upvote the ones you most want answered.
Jenni and Advita, the wait is over. CommConnect 5th year. The stage is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're tuning in from. It's an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be here with you all today. So today, Jenni and I are going to talk about how we can motivate leaders to be better communicators during change. Now, we don't have any polls because we don't like to mess around with technology. So instead, we're going to ask you in the chat just to say yes or no if you have ever had any challenges with leaders when it comes to them being motivated during change. And we're going to go through 5 key top tips and techniques to help you manage that. Before we get into it, my name is Advita Patel. I am the founder of Comms Rebel, if it's not obvious behind me. We're a consultancy based in Manchester in the UK where we help organizations build confident workplaces through inclusive and effective communications. I'm also the co-founder of the Asian Comms Network and also a Leader Like Me, which I have founded with the wonderful Priya Bates, who you'll be seeing later. And of course, our new venture with the wonderful Jenni, with my bestie, the Belief Builders as well. And that's who we are coming with you today. So I'm going to hand over to Jenni while I sort the slides off to do the introductions.
Nice seamless segue. So my name's Jenni. Hi everyone. It's lovely to be with you today, and it's lovely to be back with Contact Monkey, having been with them in their office in Toronto earlier this year as well. So as Advita said, we work together on the Belief Builders, which we're launching this week, which is very exciting. But I'm also the founder and CEO of Redefining Communications, where I specialize in helping organizations go from chaos to calm. And I do that by focusing on leadership credibility and internal communication. And Advita and I have worked together for a number of years, trying to help organizations communicate better, build confident workforces, and build credible leaders.
So we're heading into the first tip.
So this is about hang on, let me start again. I've already done one speaking session today. Hang on, right. So what we want to talk about today is how you can motivate leaders. But to start with, we have to think about ourselves. So the first thing we wanted to talk about on our 5 tips is having presence and pace. Now, this is about balancing urgency with that thoughtful strategy. Now, when I think about this, I always come back to the resilience technique of thinking about what you're in control of and what you can influence. And in communications, it's really important for us to be aware of that, because I've worked in this industry for over 20 years now, and we definitely blend what we can control and what we can influence. So when it comes to thinking about that balance of urgency and strategy, we have to be clear about what we can control, what we can influence. So think about that in terms of your remit, because it will be different for everybody. The other thing when we're thinking about presence and pace is busy. Now, if anyone's heard me chat before, you'll have heard me talk about the fact that busy is not an excuse. It's very easy for us to say we're too busy to do something, and sometimes we can wear it as a bit of a badge of honor, but that makes it a little bit toxic. And actually, if you're using busy as an excuse, what you're really saying is you're prioritizing other things, and that's a much better way of managing your stakeholders. So if you're trying to balance that urgency and that thoughtfulness and that speed and slowing down, stop telling people you're too busy and start telling people that you're just prioritizing something else, but you'll get to that at another time. The final thing I want to talk about presence and pace is the boundaries that you have in place. Now, when I was a global head of comms for a FTSE 250 organization, I remember getting the train at 6:15 a.m. to get in the office for 7:30 a.m. to be able to speak to anyone in Asia or other parts of the world. I then wouldn't leave the office until about 5:30, 6 p.m. to then get home around 7, 8 o'clock. Now, I loved this job. It was brilliant. It was one of my favorite jobs in my career. But after about 6 months to a year of doing this, and the organization was doing very well, I decided to have a conversation with my boss to say, look, I'm going to leave at 4 o'clock because it means I can get home at a reasonable time. And it also means that if the change or a crisis comes in, I've got space to go into that. If I keep working 7 till 7, I've got nowhere to go should something happen that needs my time. And actually, nothing bad happened. So it's about making sure that you've got those boundaries in place so that if something does happen, when the change does come, you're able to manage your own presence and your pace because you've allowed space to be created for that crisis or change to come in. So a handy tip, and I promise you, nothing bad happens when you make that change. I did it, didn't get sacked, nothing bad happened, it was fine.
And somebody did ask in the chat when Louise was talking about conserving energy, and this is where that is really important, what Jenny just shared about making sure that you have that space to conserve your energy, especially during a change program where pace is quick and there's lots of things happening at any one time, which now leads us into understanding your leader. So I always like to describe ourselves as communication pros, as business leaders with communications expertise. And in order for us to understand our leaders, we need to recognize and understand their style of communication. Now, I use a behavioral communication tool called DISC. Now, some of you may not have heard of that, but DISC is basically themed around 4 key areas. And what these 4 communication preference areas tell you is how people communicate outwardly to other people and how they look at themselves as communicators as well. So the 4 areas of DISC is D, which is red energy. So D is all about folks who are more dominant, they're direct, they're doers, they're very task orientated, and they want to get things done. I worked with a leader where we had the motto, be bold, be brief, be gone. That is where you are when you're like a red energy leader. Then you've got leaders who are very yellow. And these folks are inspiring, influential, they're innovative. They love to come up with different ideas. They love a conversation. They're very social. You could put this leader in front of hundreds of people in a town hall or a colleague conference, and they will thrive. They love that interaction. And these folks are very much people focused. So they love that connection. Then you've got the folks who are in the high energy. So S, steady, stable, loyal, very people focused, but active listeners. So these are the folks who listen to what's going on around them. They're very observant. They're very reflective. They need time generally to go away and think about what they need to say. So if you are working with a leader who is a very high energy green, as I would call them, generally you need to give them a little bit of space and time to reflect on what you're asking them to do. And then you're moving to the high energy blues. So generally these folks are conscientious, they're correct, they are very concise, they're very process driven generally. So they like a process, they like the detail, they don't like to go against status quo often. And they do have a way of wanting to communicate in that's defined by rules and regulations. We can talk more about this. Jenny and I are both DISC accredited, but there's a great book by a guy called Thomas Erickson, and he's written a book called Surrounded by Idiots, and many other books as well. But that is a really good book to get a great overview of these characteristics. And the reason I talk about these 4 communication styles is because once you understand them, of your leadership, then you can adjust and adapt your style and speak their language that will help them connect with you better, especially when it comes to change. Change communications is so different because you're working at pace generally. There's lots happening. There's lots of different bits of information. You may have a different team that you need to communicate with, and having a broad brush with leaders and expecting them to all behave in the same way isn't going to work when you are building motivation in them. So get to know your leader, understand their style, what works for them. Some will love a stage, some will prefer one-to-one, some will prefer email, some will like videos. The more you know about them, the more you can make that communication channel more bespoke and tailored to their needs, and build trust, most importantly, with them. Because when they recognize that you understand them, they're more likely to open up with you and share their worries and challenges that they're facing with their teams.
And I think the important thing here is also bringing that in now. So if you know that change is coming, or you know that something might be around the corner, investing in that relationship and that understanding now before it comes is hugely helpful. And I know there's been some stuff in the chat about different frameworks. Whatever framework you're using is going to help you understand your leader, but we have to do that work now so that when the change comes, we can adapt to advise and support them and motivate them in the way that we know is going to get the outcome that we're looking for. The next is about really believing the change. So I obviously have to talk about this, having written a book called Nobody Believes You. And this is all about creating that trust and credibility. So how aligned are those words and behaviours from the leadership team? And this is about the leadership team. If you're going through change, it can't just be one person. No leader is an island. They are a team. So we have to look at this as a group, and we have to make sure that there is that alignment there and that credibility from the people that are leading that organisation. Now, when I talk about credibility, I talk about the 8 practices of being a leader that people will follow. This is based on some research that I've done. I'm going to run through those 8, but I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail today on it, but let me know if you'd like some more. But the 8 practices of being credible, in alphabetical order, not importance, are being capable. So making sure that you're taking action, you've got knowledge about what you're doing, making sure that you're empathetic. This is very important. Making sure that you're being human and you're being open, and all of those things about empathy, being caring and compassionate, really important. The next one is having integrity. And I'll come on to why that's so important during change, but integrity is the one that everybody likes to think they have, but actually in reality, we don't often have as much as we like to think. The next is being likable. To be a credible leader, you need to be likable. This isn't about being liked. This is about making sure that you are nice to be around, you're charismatic, all of those things. So it's an important distinction. Leaders have to have that trait in order to make sure that people want to be around them. The next is being supportive. So making sure you're creating safe spaces, you're being inclusive. And then we have trustworthy, which is really important when it comes to change. We want to make sure that we are trustworthy, we're reliable, and we're honest, and we're transparent. The last 2 practices of being credible are being visionary. So that means that you can communicate well, you can inspire others, you're really passionate. It's not about being a visionary leader, but it's about having that vision that you can take people on that journey of change. And then the final one is being vulnerable. Now, vulnerability is all about creating connection. So we want to balance being personal but not intimate with the outcome of creating connection when we talk about vulnerability. Now, I've whistled through those 8, but the ones that I want to talk about just a little bit more today when it comes to really believing the change and going through that change as a leader is integrity, supportive, and empathetic. We have to focus on integrity when it comes to change, because if you don't have integrity, you will get distrust. And as I said, integrity is the one that we all like to think we have, but actually it's very easy not to have integrity. It's very easy to think you're saying the right thing and doing it, but you have to have someone in your corner to show you where you might be making a misstep. There will be unintended consequences of the decisions, the communication, the actions from the leadership team. So we have to make sure that mirror is being held up there. And then I talk about supportive and empathetic as the other ones to really hone in on when it comes to change communication with the leadership team, because sometimes it's moving so quickly and you're a middle manager and you don't quite know what's happening and you don't really have the answers, or you don't agree with them, or you're being impacted. And so trying to cover off all of those bases to be a leader people will follow is really tough. So if you just focus on being supportive and being empathetic, that's about giving people people your time. And that's the most important thing when it comes to creating that trust and credibility during change.
And then when you are building the credibility in your leadership and you're having those conversations, there will be elements of it where you do need to kind of go back and reflect on your relationship with that leader to be able to have those honest and open conversations, because that's critical when you are building trust. So Jenni mentioned trustworthiness, and there's a great book called The Trusted Advisors, and they've written a book about trustworthiness and what that means. And there's an equation which is around credibility, intimacy, and being able to build relationships really well. So check that book out. I do like sharing that book because it's an old book, but it's a really relevant one as well. So as we move into motivating your leader when it comes to that, convincing them and getting them a bit excited or even just part of the change, we need to look at confidence. Building their confidence to influence in the right way. Now, in my experience, I've worked with several leaders and several organizations where they have one standardized way of communicating with their colleagues. And what they don't often recognize or understand is that everybody's going through change at a different pace. So you'll have some people who are very ready to go and move forward with it and ready to crack on. And you're going to have some individuals who are a little bit more reflective and a bit more stable with the change and want to understand the why. Again, relating to one of those behavioral frameworks that we've mentioned, like DISC or Insights or Gallup, and using that kind of knowledge base that you have to understand where people might be. I like to use the change curve. I know not everybody agrees with the change curve, but it's a Culber-Ross change curve is a great, in my opinion, change framework to understand the journey that people are taking when it comes to the change that's happening. So there's 4 different styles of communication when you consider what people are going through. So you've got the engage stage, right? So engage is where the change has just been announced. So here, the leader's role and responsibility, and this is where we would guide them as communication professionals, their role at this point is to inform people, is to make sure that they have the right support around them and they've got the whole persuasion. So comms will be very different here. So this is where you might have a one-to-one taking place. You may do some more intimate focus groups. They may do personalized emails at this point as well, just to kind of get people engaged in what this change looks like. So it's not just about broadcasting one email out there. It's about being sensitive to how people may be reacting to that change. And then you kind of need to look at the energized phase. So everyone's kind of understood what the change is. There may be a little bit of hesitation. People are feeling a little bit freaked out about what's going on. So now the leader needs to kind of come in and energize certain groups. And at this point, this is where you need to kind of think about enthusiasm. And what does that look like for the teams that they're working with? Reaffirm the change. You know, it's really important during a change comms that when you're communicating, that you not only are you talking about the things that are changing, but also the things that are staying the same. We often forget about that. We often forget to share the things that are staying the same. And that just helps build that encouraging conversation, that two-way conversation that we often talk about, that active listening, giving that safe space for people to share their worries if they have got any, or talk about questions. It's not just a one and done. And we need to be really careful that we encourage our leader to keep those communication lines open. So our role as communication leaders at this time is to make sure that they've got the relevant information, the FAQs, the PATs, all of that kind of stuff that will build confidence in the communications that they are deploying and communicating. Then you've got the kind of empower stage. So by this point now, folks will be ready to they understand the change, they recognize what it might mean for them. So how do we now empower them to move forward with this change? And this is where you need to look at giving people autonomy to think about how this looks for them and what this means for them. Look at how you're building confidence in them leading the change within their own remit and what it means for them. And also looking at things like visibility. So giving them the space to kind of share with their own teams or with their own peers or their own projects about how this change is going to happen to them. So this might be, again, more the channels that you use will be quite relevant in here, encouraging the leaders to mix things up and change it up as well. So not everybody is going to relate to an email. not everybody is going to relate to a drop-in session. Some people will need a more intimate conversations, and some people will like videos or podcasts and things like that. So have a think about how do you energize and empower folks at this stage. And then the final bit of what you might need to consider about adjusting how leaders build conviction is how they're embedding the change. And this is where you need to kind of look at recognition. So celebrating people who have contributed to the change, recognizing what's worked really well, lessons learned, learning from what people are saying to you, feeding back, keeping those, again, communication lines open. So this is where you may do a colleague conference or a town hall and allow people to have open-ended questions to build transparency. And those are the kind of phases that align quite nicely to the Colbell-Ross change model, where people may come in with disbelief and anger, head into a bit of a low moment, and then go into reaffirmation. And this is where your comms needs to be adapted. And we are busy and we have different priorities, but this is critical in order for the leader to build trust with their teams and make sure that the change that you're communicating is resonating with the population.
I love that one because it links so nicely to this one about becoming a trusted advisor, because that model that Advita was just talking through about aligning the messages to the change is really where our role comes in as being that trusted advisor. We want to make sure that the work we're doing has impact. And if we can advise leaders to help them be more confident through that change and have that conviction, then we're doing the job of a communication professional. Now, I know there'll be many people here that will be different levels in an organization, but that advisory role is going to be so important for anyone at any level inside a communications function, especially with all this AI talk that's coming in about taking everyone's jobs. I was just on another session about that. The one superpower we've really got is this advisory piece. But in order to really demonstrate that, we have to move beyond outputs and really prove that we can measure the value. Whenever I talk about change and impact and objectives and communication, I always talk about the organizational objectives. If you want to show that meaningful impact, your measure is the change itself. It's not how many people have read an article on an intranet. It's not how many people have seen a poster or a flyer. It's whether or not the change has had the outcome that it needed to have, which is why your objectives are really important up front. But if I take an example of a change campaign, maybe looking at health and safety and how we need to change behaviours around accidents and making sure that we're being safer. So this is a behaviour change piece, which means it's not just communication professionals involved, but you've got health and safety, you've probably got learning and development, you've got all sorts of different people involved in that. But the outcome is that we reduce accidents by 60%. That's what we want to measure. That's the impact that we're having. We need to make sure that that is achieved. And that's only can be done by doing different checks and measures along the way and then changing our approach. But those objectives are really important to set in order for us to achieve that and be that trusted advisor. The other thing I want to talk about when it comes to us having impact and being in that advisory role is playing back those 8 practices of credible leadership. We talk about leaders a lot and what leaders need to do to be someone people will follow, but you are the leader when it comes to communication. You're the expert there. You want people to follow you in terms of your advice. So how much are you being supportive? How much are you being empathetic? How much are you creating those safe spaces for leaders to ask questions and maybe not know the answers? We have to show up in that way as well if we want to help leaders have that conviction, be trusted, be credible, and make sure that they're able to deliver that. So that's my sort of final question, is how are you making sure that you're demonstrating that to your leaders to be that trusted advisor?
And don't be afraid at this point to have these conversations with the leaders. So somebody in the chat was saying, are we talking about comms leaders? Are we talking about leaders? We're talking about business leaders. So as communication, whatever role you play in your organization or client facing, this is about how do you motivate business leaders, so leaders within your organization, to be motivated during change. And they're not just reading off a script. They're actually embracing their role that they have to play, because we are, as much as we can enable and communicate certain change programs, most of the biggest impact, in our opinion, comes from the leadership team. So the leadership team need to believe in this change, or motivate, have that motivation to help their colleagues understand why this change is important. Because most change programs are dependent on how the leader is feeding back and communicating as well. Just to summarize, before we go into questions, I can see lots of questions popping into the Q&A box. So this is our kind of leadership activation checklist. Just to summarize, do you have boundaries in place to avoid reactive messaging? So are you making sure that you've got boundaries in place and time to review what's happening around you internally and externally, listening to colleague voices, making sure that you've got time for your own mental and physical well-being as well? Because when you're burnt out or when you're struggling, it's difficult to advise and guide your leaders in what they need to do. So make sure you've got your boundaries in place. Do you understand your leader's communication style and preference? So you can use whatever framework tool you want. You may decide that none of them are good or useful for you. So it's about having those conversations with them and asking them curious questions about their style. What do they like? What don't they like? What works? What doesn't work? What's their preference? How do you want to kind of encourage and nudge them into their style of communication to their colleagues? Does your leader genuinely believe in the change? And that's really important to have the honest, transparent conversation, because if you don't know, as the communication leader who's helping that leader communicate to their team, then it's going to be very difficult for you to craft those messaging for them. Can they communicate with confidence even when they're facing uncertainty? So again, this is about understanding where they are on their communication with change, and do they recognize and understand what this change means for them, their team, and for the organization as a whole, and how confident do they feel about this change as well, and how are they showing up for their peers, but also for their colleagues? And then, are you moving beyond activity metrics to demonstrate real value? And Jenny, spot on. We need to have objectives with solid outcomes that are measured in proper metrics that allows us to check whether the change is having desired impact. There's often a lot of investment that goes into change, so we want to make sure that we're delivering against those objectives and we have the relevant outcomes required as well. So we know we shared quite a lot there, so we have got a little activation guide for you. So if you scan that QR code, you'll be emailed a guide that has several questions that you need to consider when you're going through change. So I'll leave that on screen just for a second while we get into questions, Jenny.
Yes, I was just having a quick scroll through. So there was a bit of chat in the chat about how to see the latest questions, but I've got a little sort by at the top of mine, which means I can go to latest. So I'm hoping other people can do the same. There is a question in here around, oh, I like that, about colours. I'm going to ask you, Advita. So Irene has said, what colour do you think is best for a successful and well-liked internal communications leader?
Oh, I've just literally got my qualification in being a business trainer, and one of the key things that came out of that was there's no colour is right for it. There's no right or wrong in the colour. It's really important, and I know that's a bit of a chicken question answer there, but it's really important not to define ourselves by the colours, right? The colours are a guide in how we may approach the environment that we are. And all of us have the ability to bend, not break, which is one of our good friends, Sarah Brake, saying, in adjusting our style, not our personality, adjusting our style dependent on the environment that we're in. So if you're working in an environment, say you're working for a very kind of regulatory environment that's quite process driven, you as a communications leader may need to lean more into your high blue energy. So you're conscientious, you're concise, your correctness and detail, potentially. If you're working for an organization that is quite vibrant and is kind of out there, doesn't really have much plans, is quite innovative, you may need to lean into your red potentially. So you're more a doer, you're more directive, you may need to be the decision maker. in that room. So you have to kind of embrace what's happening around you and recognize where your strengths are and where you may need to kind of elevate some of your communication behaviors, because we have all four within us, by the way. We just have a preference of a one or two, but we can, it's like a dial. If you imagine a music system, you can dial up and dial down. So you may need to dial up one of your communication preferences based on the leader that you're working with or the organization, or dial down. I am a very high energy yellow with red, and Jenny is a very high energy blue with red. So you can imagine that Jenny and I have very interesting conversations where she's very kind of process focused, and I'm like, let's just do this and let's just do that. But we meet in the middle.
Yeah, it's great for I'm very calm about that. I'm absolutely fine. There's a question that's come in for me from Charles, which says I said we often don't have as much integrity as we like to think we do. Can you explain that, Jenny? So just to clarify that, integrity is all about doing what we say we're going to do, and it's about being accountable. Sometimes that's hard to do. So if we've said we're going to get back to somebody by Friday, and then Friday comes and goes and we haven't replied to them, that little thing like that is going to chip away at that integrity. It's those little things that will make a difference. Integrity is a big word. It's a very loaded word. So it can feel like it's got to be something huge that's going to take that away, but it's often all of those little things. And accountability, which is part of integrity, is also quite a challenge for us as human beings, because we can often find ways to make excuses for behavior or things that have happened without having to be accountable. So that's why it can be a challenge, because it can be, even with the best of intentions, we can let little elements of our integrity slip. But I always say it's never done with intention. So it's not like somebody's out there desperately trying to not have integrity. It will be that other priorities come in, we're juggling a lot, and just unfortunately it just chips away, even though we might pride ourselves on having a lot of integrity. There was a question in the chat, Advita, which you wouldn't have seen, but you recommended a book, and somebody just said, what was the last book recommendation? Was it
the Trusted Advisors, yeah, by Charles H. Green. Trusted Advisor by Charles H. Green. I've just seen a question from Margot, which I think many of us can relate with. What do we do if the leaders do not genuinely believe in the change or are not very confident about it? Great question, Margot. Do you want to go first, Jenny?
Oh, thanks. So if they don't believe in the change, I would find bits of the change that they do believe in. So I'm thinking about a leadership team that I'm working with at the moment, where there's quite a lot of change going on around sort of values, culture, organizational structure, strategy. It's all happening at once. And I think even though they might not be comfortable with the change, there are elements to it that they do believe in. Maybe not the whole thing, but there's different elements to it that do align. So in the conversations I'm having where we're looking at the narrative and the stories we tell and those things, part of my job with them is trying to find that comfort for them in that message and where we can find that belief. I think if you've got a leader in a senior leadership position, I'm talking here, if they really don't believe in the change, then they'll probably leave. And in the one-to-one work I do with leadership teams during change, where we're having sort of one-to-one conversations about their communication, behaviours, all those things, if they don't believe in it, then they usually will go, either through conversations with the CEO to reorganise the team, or because they don't want to stay, the values aren't there and stuff like that. So it's having some of those honest conversations as well, which you might not be in a position to do, but are very helpful.
Yeah. And it's also, to Jane's point, understanding, is it that they don't believe in the change, or is it that they don't have confidence in themselves to talk about the change? Because they're very different ways of working with them. If they don't believe in the change, then that is definitely something that will have to be addressed at a senior level based on their roles and responsibilities in the organization. And that is beyond what we would do, I would say. We may advise and guide the best we can. However, the confidence element is definitely a part that we can play. And this is where you need to ask those kind of questions about where are the gaps that they believe that they don't have the knowledge or the information from, and what is it that they need from you to help them communicate better. So one leader I worked with was being pushed into doing these big town hall messages from a global perspective, and it was freaking him out every time, and he couldn't build that connection that he was really wanting to build. He was a very a yellow green he was, and he really wanted to do the people element. So we split that out into more intimate events for him, and worked with him to kind of build that connection and listen to his team about what was going on, what was happening, which helped build his confidence in that. So understand, is it about they don't want to do it and they don't get it and they don't want to participate, or is it that they just don't have the confidence in communicating about it? Because two very different approaches.
So someone's asked here, any tips for negotiating or influencing managers and leaders? I've noticed some individuals can be closed off to other opinions or solutions and want to proceed with their ideas. And I'm going to add in brackets, because they're the best. Any thoughts on that, Advita?
This is a really good question, because I will always then go into the consequences. So I will always then bring in, what are the consequences of doing it this way? What are the consequences of doing that way? And what are we trying to achieve as a group together to achieve the objective and the outcome? As soon as you talk about consequences and the impact of doing something a certain way, it gets people to think a bit differently about what they are saying. I often also lean into some coaching tactics where I'll repeat back what they are saying as well, so they can hear back their suggestion, because often that then makes their brain slow down a little bit to realize, actually, that's not what I meant, or that wasn't the way I wanted to articulate that. But always kind of, if you're feeling that conflict, is because you've got people who are probably working quite quickly and a fast pace and not really thinking about what the impact generally sometimes. And you may have people that just need a little bit more evidence and time to reflect. I would always kind of bring it in the middle to close that gap and say, right, okay, what are the consequences of doing it that way? And what are the consequences of doing that way? And what are we trying to achieve together as a team?
Love that. And I think if you have got someone who really does want to go with their ideas, because they're the best, regardless, then let them. So I had this conversation with someone the other day who was a more junior member of staff, being really worried about her leader doing certain stuff, and felt compelled to fix things and come up with a solution. And I just said, let them, they have to find that solution. They have to do that and deal with the consequences. You don't have to fight all the time. And sometimes, I often talk about, is it a hill you want to die on? Because I've died on many a hill in my career. and I think you have to think about that sometimes. So I think absolutely what Advita was saying was spot on around the consequences, having that conversation. But if you're being really closed off, then let them, knowing that you're probably going to have to pick up the pieces afterwards. But sometimes we have to go through that in order to actually have the influence that we want in the longer term. So just picking your battles a little bit, I suppose, is the bit for me. I
always say that you have to lose the battle to win the war.
Yeah.
So it's really important to remember that. Is it worth losing that battle to win that war? I think we have time for one more quick question. We've got 40 seconds on that thing.
Let's do it.
So how would you advise leaders to be transparent about feedback on change when feedback is negative and it reflects badly on them or the efforts to that point?
So I'll be brief, because I've sort of just done this actually, where we had some feedback on a leadership team that they hadn't handled change particularly well, and it was quite uncomfortable. And so to reset that, the CEO sent out an email to all employees saying, sorry, and I've not got this quite right, and I need to do this differently, and this is what I'm going to do differently because I've listened to you, and I'm sorry I haven't got it quite right. That's not going to be the answer for everybody, but we had to draw a line in the sand to reset in order to move forwards. And I think sometimes you have to hold your hands up and do that. So that's what I've done.
Brilliant. Right on time.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, we're just getting...
Oh, you're going to love the tech.
Gotta love the tech. Now we can't hear them at all.
Jenni and Advita, my key takeaway is to stop telling stakeholders you're too busy and that you're prioritizing something else. That's a good reminder.
Absolutely. I love the point that about understanding leaders. I totally get that it's important to understand the language of your leader. That one definitely resonated with me.
Audience, we'd love to hear from you what resonated too. So keep the chat going and drop in one thing you'll take back to your own organization after hearing this session.
All right. We'll be just give us a quick break, and we'll be right back in 20 seconds.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.